I'm Jim,
And I'm Garrett.
and this is
Jim
Jim
and
and Garrett
Garrett
at
at
the
the
movies.
movies.
Welcome, everybody, to this episode of Jim and Garrett at the movies. We will be talking about Stan and Ollie, a awards hopeful that didn't get any awards, and we'll also be talking about Chaplin, Richard Attenborough's biopic of the great Charlie Chaplin, and finally going through some of the Oscar nominees, snubs, surprises, predictions, reactions, you know. So let's get into Stan and Ollie first. This is a film directed by John S. Baird. It stars John C. Reilly and Steve Coogan as Stan and Ollie, as Laurel and Hardy. Coogan plays Laurel, and John C. Reilly, of course, plays Hardy. This tells the story of their tour later in their career, of Britain, their English tour, after their film days had gone south, and as Oliver is trying to rustle up a good old comeback for the two of them. There are also some background issues that come up between the friends, but overall, I'll let you go ahead and start, Garrett. What did you think of this movie?
Well, this film I thought was very charming. I thought the chemistry between Coogan and Riley was spot on. You could feel both the professional tension, but also the professional respect and the friendship between them. The casting I thought was just wonderful. Both lead actors were really into the roles, and I think they really sort of lost themselves in just the way you want to see. It was generally funny, but at the same time, also in some ways, almost kind of like an anthropologist's trip back in time, because on its own merits, I think a lot of what Laurel and Hardy's audience has found funny about them isn't really terribly funny to a modern audience. You appreciate it in the sense of being kind of like a time traveler going back in time. But if you were to, I think if most viewers were to watch a Laurel and Hardy film instead of this biopic, they probably would not be too terribly engaged.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, let me first agree with a lot of what you said about the film. I thought it was charming, though slightly innocuous. I thought the John C. Reilly and Steve Coogan were fantastic together. I really enjoyed John C. Reilly's performance. He's got sort of this silent, soft charm about him that I think is perfect for Hardy. In terms of the discussion about Laurel and Hardy and Laurel and Hardy's films, I don't know. I enjoy them. I think they're funny, but not. You're right that they're not. They haven't aged terribly well, but they're perfect. You're right. You're also right in the sense that it's a kind of reflection of this bygone vaudeville era. But I have such a fascination with that era in and of itself. Like I almost like the idea that it was sort of these traveling troupes of actors who would perform the same bits. And it was almost as though you could interchange the characters in many cases because they almost knew each other's material. It would almost be as though somebody could go do Jim Gaffigan's stand-up routine in Des Moines without Jim Gaffigan having to go to Des Moines. Those kinds of things were I like that era. I think that's an interesting era in entertainment history, and so I can agree with you to the point that it's anthropological, but I also enjoy it a little bit more than I think you do. And so this film had a little bit more charm. Perhaps it had a little bit more charm for me because it was resurrecting some of those old vaudeville routines that I kind of knew from watching the old Laurel and Hardy bits, etc.
New mission for 2019: we got to bring vaudeville back.
I'd love to do vaudeville. I'd love to bring vaudeville back. I mean, the whole vaudeville circles. I mean, they challenged actors back in the vaudeville days, and I enjoyed the hell out of it. Back in when I was studying theater, we kind of did some vaudeville-esque kind of bullshit, and I enjoyed the hell out of it. So, yeah, it had a little bit more charm than that for me. So it wasn't fully anthropological. That said, I don't think a lot of this film is focusing on the vaudeville days. It's trying to drill down into this relationship. And uh, I let's see if you agree with this. I didn't think that it had anything terribly revolutionary to say about that relationship. It's kind of like, you know who were really great friends? Laurel and Hardy. Yeah, they had their troubles, but guess what? They were really great friends, which is exactly what I would expect of Laurel and Hardy.
I think revolutionary might be setting the bar a little high, but
Revolutionary? Is there a word that there's not revelatory?
revelatory. Gotcha. Okay.
How about that?
Um,
Yeah,
I
revelatory.
mean, I think that's a lower bar, but also I think that's a bar the film meets at least somewhat. I mean, for example, I think the parts that I liked about the film the most were when how they explored their creative process, how the writing and the rehearsal, and how they sort of developed the bits, and you sort of get that behind the scenes look, because you can see what they did on screen well enough if you wanted to go back and look at it. There's plenty of stuff on the internet you can find, just see what the end result is like, but you don't necessarily know what it's like for the process. And as a person
Mhm.
who's interested in different people's creative processes, but who has never worked as part of a comedy duo on stage or screen, it's interesting to see how they worked together to develop their routines. So yeah, I think that was, for me at least, I thought that was somewhat revelatory. It showed me an aspect of of creative work that I didn't wasn't otherwise exposed to. And while I might have been able to guess a certain amount, it's nice to be able to have it sort of shown to me rather than having to guess.
Sure, sure. And yeah, I can see where you're coming from there. I think that this is trying to turn this it seems as though the film is trying to set itself up as this examination of this relationship through with the creative process and the show sort of being a backdrop. And because a lot of time is spent on this relationship, and I don't know how much the film really has to say about that relationship. Does that make sense?
Yeah, well, again, I want to avoid a spoiler here because again, our reviews are spoiler free. But the thing I liked the absolute most about the movie was the very last line at the end, after the curtain has fallen and there's the text run through. There's the final line simply lifted my heart. It made me love the movie so much more, and it worked precisely because the film justified that final line. The film made that final line make sense. If it had just dropped on its own without the buildup, it would have felt a little cheap, maybe, or maybe a curiosity. But when you had that emotional foundation laid between the two of them, and then you get that final line at the end, it made my heart soar.
Aw, that's lovely. And I think this is a film that's kind of aiming for that kind of reaction. That it's just sort of this lovely kind of if innocuous, lighthearted trip into this nice friendship that created a legendary comedy duo. Have you watched any of the Laurel Hardy films?
Yeah, back in the day, bits and
Mhm.
pieces here and there. I don't know if I've ever actually sat down and watched an entire one start to finish, but they're part of the sort of cultural background radiation. It's hard to not see at least some of their stuff just growing up.
Right. Yeah, and some of the mostly what they did were the shorts that would sort of go before the features back in the early days of cinema. And I've seen a bunch of those shorts, and they're charming as all hell. Um, I did I did do a really stupid thing as I was walking into the theater. I was like, "Oh, I'm gonna get to hear who's on first," and then I realized, "Oh wait, that's a completely different comedy duo."
Right.
But yeah, stupid,
And
foolish
but it is
moment on
interesting
my
because
part.
again, there's a nod to Abbott and Costello in there
Mhm.
in the film, and then a nod to Chaplin as well,
Chaplin, yeah,
and Buster Keaton. And even if you're not sort of intimately familiar with the corpus, with the work of these individuals, there is again this sort of broader culture that you're at least vaguely familiar with if you paid any attention at all to the history of cinema and the comedy. And like I say, it creates this sort of anthropological sense that there was this whole world out there and that people loved these performers. And even if I myself don't fall in love with their routines, and if I was sitting in the audience with my cultural background, wouldn't have found it quite so enamored to watch two adult men do a dainty little dance around a stage. Clearly, it meant so much to the people who were showing up at their shows, and to so many of their fans. And so, even if you're not a fan per se, I think you can appreciate how much that means to people, to have creative work enlighten their lives like that.
And it successfully humanizes those two characters as well. I think that's one of the film's great strengths, is that it's able to humanize these characters that in the background, like, have been sort of reduced to this cultural backdrop. To know what they were like and how good of friends they were, I think is a really touching and lovely sentiment. I like how you described their dance as dainty. I think that's absolutely perfect. So overall, what would you say about this? Or do you have another point
before we go to bottom lines, I think we've been saying generally positive things. Do you have any critical things, any things you particularly didn't like about them? You called it innocuous. Is there more you want to build on that?
Yeah, I don't think it's, as I was saying before, I don't think it's reaching for anything particularly revelatory. I don't think it's reaching for anything particularly higher than being this sort of diversionary film that celebrates a friendship. I don't think that it's trying to do much beyond what it accomplishes. And in that sense, it's a successful film. I like it, but I don't think it's not taking any big swings, which means it's hitting some singles and maybe a couple doubles, but no, this is not a home run hitter of a film. At the end of it, I felt like I had spent a nice 2 hours, but I don't think that I had learned anything particular about the nature of friendship or the nature of creativity or the nature of comedy or the nature of film in during that era. So there wasn't too much there. There wasn't too much meat for me to sink my teeth into. I found it to be a perfectly fine film, rather than some of the other awards contenders that are really taking some big swings this year. So
yeah, I somewhat agree. I agree it's not a terribly ambitious film. It's not trying to show us into the heart and soul of these particular people. But at the same time, again, I do think it was more revelatory for me. Maybe you simply knew more about their material and their history going into it than I did. But
I don't mean to sort of cast myself as this great film scholar or anything like that. I don't mean to do that, but yeah, I go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah. So, but at the same time, one of the things I did sort of share, maybe not necessarily disappointment, but a sense that the film maybe could have done a little bit more. There's some B stories with their wives.
Right.
And there's one major tension which they I'm assuming is standing in for a host of other sort of tensions between the two of them over the course of their lives. And structurally, the film felt a little peculiar. It starts off, like roughly like 20 years, I think, before, and then flashes forward, and then it sort of feels like there's there's an initial conflict which they resolve by the time you get to the end of the first act, and then it's like, okay, so what's the conflict now? And it sort of meanders around a bit before it sinks its teeth into the next sort of tension that the film can sort of base itself around. Again, none of these are major problems or major crimes. The film is still enjoyable as you go, but you do sort of, I was feeling that if they really wanted to sort of tighten it up a little bit, if they could plug some of these holes, it might have elevated it and made it a little bit more profound, perhaps.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't know if it would have made it more profound. It certainly would have made it tighter. Profundity sort of comes from trying to say something universal about the nature of friendship or the nature of art or the nature of creative process and all of that. And I don't know if this story has that in it. It's entirely possible that it does, but I mean, the thing I was fascinated most about it, and this isn't too much of a spoiler, especially so Laurel wants to sort of strike out on their own, and at the beginning of the film, this is first act stuff, so I'm not giving too much away. He wants to strike out on their own, and Hardy kind of wants to stay with their current producer, and that causes a rift between the two friends. And I kind of wondered, like, if there was more regret on Laurel's part, if there's more regret about, if there is a sort of I could have been a contender scene in this story, that if it was told differently, but maybe I'm mistaken, and this is just they weren't that kind of people. They weren't the kind of people who would, I could have been somebody. I could have been bigger than Chaplin instead of doing this. Maybe that's a scene that I'm making up in my head. But that would seem to be something that would elevate the material, because then it becomes about like regret over the times that you don't have without appreciating the friendship that you do. Am I writing my own movie without doing the research? Yeah. But is that movie probably reaching for something a little bit more profound than this is? Yeah.
And that brings
I don't know which one's better.
Yeah, and that brings up another theme we've discussed before about biopics, about to what extent should the primary goal be to tell the best story possible, to make the best film possible, versus staying true to the source material, which is a theme I imagine we'll discuss also when we talk about Chaplin here in a second.
Right, exactly. I think Chaplin's sort of aiming to be a different biopic, but
Right.
as you said, we'll talk about that in a second. Do you want to wrap up Stan and Ollie?
Yes.
What do you give it out of 5?
Out of 5, I give it 3.5.
I'm at 3. I think we've got a similar point of view about the film. Maybe I'm a little more down on it as we've talked, but yeah, it's a perfectly lovely time at the theater, and you'll enjoy the dainty dance. All right, so let's move on to Chaplin. This is our movie club entry. We will be discussing spoilers. This is Richard Attenborough's biopic in 1992, starring Robert Downey Jr. as the title character, Charlie Chaplin. It goes through basically his entire life. Interesting thing is Geraldine Chaplin plays her own grandmother, Charlie Chaplin's mother in this film, Hannah Chaplin. Co-stars Paul Reus. I think I said that wrong. Anyway, as his brother, and Moira Kelly, Marissa Tomei, Penelope Ann Miller, Mila Jovovich, Diane Lane, and any other actress who was hot in the 90s was also in this movie somehow. Anthony Hopkins plays a fictional biographer, and Kevin Kline plays the great Douglas Fairbanks. As I said, this sort of, in a Gandhi-esque way, goes through Chaplin's entire life and tells his story, his various loves, his famous films, and his relative troubles with politics and whatnot. What did you think? You hadn't seen this film before, had you, Garrett?
The first time I saw this film, and it was certainly interesting. I mean, one of our earlier reviews, we talked about modern times, and so some of my thoughts on Chaplin were expressed there, and in some ways they were broadened and deepened, in other ways reaffirmed. I mean, starting as typical with the strengths, Robert Downey Jr.'s performance is wonderful, just truly amazing. I mean, he embodies the character and shows, I think, in just an incredibly talented way, the deep and profound sadness of the man, who's known principally as a clown on screen, but you see off screen this deep reservoir of dissatisfaction, of ennui, and while I think Robert Downey Jr. in general, I think, is a talented actor, this is, I think, doubtlessly one of the best performances I've ever seen from him. And I think, as I recall, he got a lot of praise, and rightly so at the time.
Oscar nomination too.
Yeah, Oscar nomination, right? Yeah, and also, wonderful was the costuming and the set design. I think they did a fantastic job of recreating the sense of time and the period. You really feel like you're walking back into really old school Hollywood. The supporting cast, which was again copious, did a fine job, sort of bolstering and reflecting light back into to Downey's Chaplin. So all those are strengths. I have some criticisms, but first, why don't you tell me what you thought of the film overall?
Sure. This is one of my, I really like this movie because this was one of the films that made me fall in love with Charlie Chaplin. I saw this when it first came out, in '92. I liked it then, and it made me want to know more about Chaplin. So I started my early sort of film education into Chaplin's film. I saw Gold Rush and The Kid, and eventually Limelight, which sort of vies for my top Chaplin movie. I really like this film. I think its scope is a little bit more than it is able to bite off by trying to encapsulate all of Charlie Chaplin's life. I think it smooths over some of the edges, and it just becomes a sort of, and then he fucked this woman, and then this woman, and then this woman, and so it just becomes a sort of parade of beautiful women that Charlie Chaplin falls in love with, and that kind of gets a little tedious at times. I kind of wanted more about the un-American thing, or the quote unquote un-American thing. The his dealings with J. Edgar Hoover and the House Committee on Un-American Activities, where he was, of course, accused of being communist. So I kind of wanted to drill down a little bit more into that. There's a scene where Moira Kelly's character, one of Moira Kelly's characters, comes up to him and says, "You're barred from America," and it's right in front of the Statue of Liberty, and that sort of came out of nowhere. So I think that by trying to encompass so much of his life, it sort of shortchanged some of the interesting aspects of his life. That said, I agree with everything you said about Downey Jr.'s performance. I think that the film is well made, as I would expect from a Richard Attenborough production. He didn't direct often, but when he directed well. And so I liked this film quite a bit. Yeah. So what are some of your criticisms?
Well, they echo a lot of what you said. The feeling I had is definitely the second half of the film felt seriously episodic. You know, just here's 10 minutes where this thing happened in his life, and once we're done with that part of the story, we move on, and nothing in those 10 minutes really matters anymore.
Right.
Basically, you know, when he's still doing his film career, it feels like everything is contributing to something. You see him developing as an artist as well as a human being. But once he more or less retires from filmmaking, and it's just sort of the latter period of his life, I didn't feel like it really had sort of lost direction. There's a really excellent scene in which James Woods gives a fantastic speech, courtroom speech, which, you know, as a performance and as a speech I really liked, but nothing within that thread of the story had any impact the second you leave that scene. You know, it's over,
right.
done, and you just move on. And there was several things that were like that, where I felt like they were just trying to put it in there because, well, this was significant in his life, and we can't tie it together organically, so we're just going to report on it. So yeah, I kind of feel like they should have narrowed it down. It should have maybe focused a little bit more on his film career, as his qua film career, and maybe set some of the loves and the family stuff aside. Which, you know, I mean, again, I can sort of understand how you would want to tell that, but it just didn't quite work in a feature film to me.
Well, as a sidebar, since you've talked about how Downey Jr. sort of captures Chaplin's sadness, I highly, highly, highly recommend Limelight. I don't know if you've seen that film.
I have not, but
Yes.
it's an excellent example, right? You know, the film
Right.
shows that they show up at the debut for Limelight, but it says nothing at all about what the film was about, or what it was expressing for him, or why it was an important film. You know, it basically, you know, scarcely existed. You know, unlike Modern Times, the way they handled Modern Times, it made sense. You understood his inspiration for that and what he was trying to express, and then, you know, you see it on the screen, the famous scenes. So, you know, there was a coherence there. Limelight came and went in this film.
Right. And yet I would say Limelight's probably the most autobiographical film of Chaplin's career, because I think you could probably make an entire biopic just out of the production of Limelight, because that's a story about a comic who is reflecting upon his career and reflecting upon who he is as an artist. And there's a great line in Limelight, we're all amateurs, that's all we ever get time to be. And that's fucking Chaplin, man. Like that's where he is in his life, and I wanted to see more of that that artistic process in the production of Limelight. Maybe because I love the movie so much, but also because I think that this biopic needed that in the same way that we did with Modern Times and The Great Dictator, where there are actual scenes that inspire those films, and you sort of see. There's a great scene where he's imitating Adolf Hitler in order to satirize and parody him. And that informs my reading of The Great Dictator. Of course, I kind of figured that out just by watching Great Dictator. But yeah, it informs my reading of that film. And I would like to see the same thing about Limelight, to your point, about how the artistic process in the second half of the film kind of goes by the wayside. Yeah. So what about any of the other performances strike to you? I thought Kevin Kline got Douglas Fairbanks perfectly.
Yeah, no, Kevin Kline was great. I thought Dan Aykroyd was wonderful. I was surprisingly disappointed with Anthony Hopkins' performance, but as I thought about it a little more, I think it was less the performance and more I felt just that the character, he didn't really have a character. He was a structural device. That was,
right.
They admit at the end they invented him as a way of telling the story for film, and that showed. It really showed. There was nothing to Hopkins's character, and it felt artificial. I felt the thumb in the frame every time his narration came up.
Yeah,
so a disappointment there from the otherwise normally fantastic Anthony Hopkins.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's no actor who could have made that role anything more than the bridge that it was. And Anthony, if you're going to build a bridge, get Anthony Hopkins to just narrate your life for you.
It helps the film. Well, in some ways, it helps them. I think the film would have been better, I think, if it just left that out entirely and didn't use that as a device. But yeah, if given that the words are on the page and you want to put them on the screen, Anthony Hopkins is certainly a voice to put behind it. But in some ways, I think it's a unfortunate mark on his record.
Either that or just have Emo Phillips narrate the film. And then Chaplin did this. Yeah, that'd be great. So yeah, Diane Lane is another one I want to sort of highlight. I think the relationship between Chaplin and Paulette Goddard was really interesting, and I kind of like Diane Lane's performance in the film.
Yeah.
Of all of the myriad of women that sort of just passed through this film, Diane Lane's the one that kind of stuck with me. Maybe that's because I love Diane Lane so much. But
yeah, I know you're a Diane Lane fan, and I mean, again, nothing against her performance per se, but just again, she at that point she was just a one face among many. I was like, oh, that's Diane Lane. Okay, well, she's probably not going to be sticking around very long. No need to get invested in her character.
Oh, what about the scene where she walks in and he's playing the piano and she says, is this how it ended with all your other wives? Probably.
You'd have to ask them. Yeah.
Yeah, or you'd have to ask them. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I mean, again, it was a good scene, but again, it still didn't feel like it went anywhere, right? I mean, that didn't. Again, you take that scene out and you show it as part of an Oscar clip, it's a fine scene. But in the context of the larger overarching narrative, it felt like it was okay, this was a thing that happened. We have to check this off the list so we can move on to the next event in his life.
Okay. All right. Well, yeah, I thought that had a little bit more meat than some of the other ones. Another thing that I want to bring up. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was going to say, a really interesting casting decision, since we're talking about casting, is that Moira Kelly had a two-part role. She played Ketty Kelly, who was his first love when he was young, and then Ona O'Neill Chaplin, his wife at the end. And I think that's an interesting decision to cast the same actor in both those roles. I'm not really sure exactly if there was a sort of a symbolism there, if it's some sort of coming full circle or something like that.
I mean, that's probably what the filmmakers intended. I mean, why would you double cast if not that? That said, she's an interesting character as well. I kind of want to see biopics about a lot of these women that passed through his life. Paulette Goddard and Una O'Neill Chaplin as well. O'Neill she's actually, let me double check this. She is related to Eugene O'Neill. Yeah, I think she's his daughter, right? Am I right on that?
I'm not sure. I recall hearing something about that too, but I certainly can't.
Yeah, I'm almost positive that she's the daughter of Eugene O'Neill. And so there's an interesting story to be told there as well. So okay. One other thing I wanted to talk about was sort of the big swing of Chaplin's career, something that we can sort of contrast with the Laurel and Hardy, the fake Laurel and Hardy film that I was making up when we were talking about Stan and Ollie. And that was that Chaplin sort of branched off on his own and formed United Artists with Douglas Fairbanks, T.W. Griffith, who is interestingly not in the film, and Paulette Goddard, and formed his own studio. He sort of took a big swing in his career in order to create the films that he wanted to do without the studio interference. What's that?
I think it was Mary Pickford who he formed United Artists.
Pickford. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. But anyway, the idea that he took this big swing and it kind of paid off, I thought that was a really interesting aspect to include, especially since we're sort of comparing and contrasting this with Stan and Ollie, a story about two people who didn't take that big swing and yet ended up sort of second tier to the legend that is Charlie Chaplin.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, it showed this sort of optimism, right? Again, like you hear him talking about that United Artists is going to be a studio where the artists are in charge, and and bigwig business producers and so forth aren't going to be in control and telling artists what to do. And while I have no inside baseball knowledge about how United Artists works these days, I'm pretty sure it's gone pretty far from that mission statement, which in some ways is really unfortunate.
Yeah, but we're all amateurs. That's all we get time to do. Yeah, for a time, perhaps it was what Chaplin dreamed, but yeah, you're right.
But another point of comparison, which sort of dovetails with this, is that Stan and Ollie again is telling a 2 months. Most of the film focuses on just a couple of months out of their lives, relatively toward the end of their careers, whereas Chaplin is deliberately epic. It's going for what can we say about a man's life in 2.5 hours. So in that respect, the scope and the ambitions of the films are very, very clearly different, and in interesting ways, because it kind of mirrors precisely what you're talking about, how the ambitions of Laurel and Hardy were sort of more muted in that respect. They were just sort of wanted to make the films and get going. They weren't trying to sort of revolutionize the business, or they weren't directors. They were just writers and stars. Whereas Chaplin, is composer, producer, director, jack of all trades.
Right.
So they're in a certain sense, the characters that the films are being made about call for those two different kinds of ambitions and scopes for trying to tell a story about them.
Yeah, and the two different directors as well. We have Richard Attenborough, who a few years earlier, about a decade earlier, made Gandhi, which is like Chaplin, a epic film that tries to encapsulate the man's entire life. And I think in Gandhi, it succeeds probably a lot better than it does in Chaplin, partially because it almost feels like there's more going on in Gandhi's life than there is in Chaplin's. But yeah, I agree with you about that. So what would you give this out of 5 total?
It's a hard call for me because, like I say, again, it is more ambitious. And for the first half-ish or so, I thought it was really succeeding, but then I felt it kind of fell down in the second half a little bit. So I think it balances out at 3 out of 5.
3 out of 5? Okay, I'm at 4. I thought you were going to go 3.5, sort of match the Stan and Ollie score, even though the criticisms are slightly different. Yeah, I'm at 4 for this film, partially because of the performance and because I think it does capture the spirit of the man, even if some of its structural inadequacies pull it back from a Gandhi-esque 5-star film. Okay, let us now talk about the Oscars. The Oscar nominations came out, and man, do I got things to say. Let's start with some snubs. I will talk about Dan Murrell started the hashtag Oscar for Tony. I have continued to tweet Oscar for Tony, and I have also vowed solemnly to never talk about the 2018 Oscars, 2018-2019 Oscars without mentioning how Toni Collette was snubbed. So Toni Collette has clearly given the best performance of 2018, bar none, in Hereditary, and she has been completely absent from awards season. This is ridiculous. Any of the actresses, Yalitza Aparicio, who's good in Roma, very good, especially considering she was a non-actress. Glenn Close, who's good in The Wife, and she's fucking Glenn Close. And Olivia Colman, who's hilarious in The Favorite. And Lady Gaga, who's doing Lady Gaga things in A Star Is Born. And Melissa McCarthy, whose performance I didn't see, but I hear is really good. All of them do not hold a candle to the great Toni Collette. I know you agree with me on this, Garrett. This is the biggest snub of award season.
Yes, undeniably. I actually am in the curious position of having not seen a single performance among the lead Oscar nominations, so I cannot comment as informatively as you have. But I definitely felt that Toni Collette was absolutely amazing in Hereditary, and certainly deserved a nomination. And it is unfortunate that she didn't get the recognition that was called on.
So why do you think this is? Is it the age-old horror movies just get snubbed because they're horror movies? I mean, clearly we don't know inside Hollywood talk, so we don't know what type of campaign the studio made for them. But I mean, is there any reasonable explanation for this aside from they just fucked up?
Well, if it was a different set of nominations, you might say there's some ageism going on, of course. But Glenn Close is actually several years older than Toni Collette, so that's pretty clearly sort of not a functional element here. Yeah, so I think the fact that it's a horror film, and horror films are notoriously not popular with the Oscar crowd, that definitely has at least something to do with it. It also probably has to do with the fact that all of the other films, I think, with the possible exception of Can You Ever Forgive Me, sort of had big sort of campaign Oscar pushes. They were all sort of vying for multiple awards. And I think when it comes to Hereditary, Toni Collette's performance is probably the only Oscar-worthy thing about that film. I mean, I suppose maybe you could give it to cinematography, possibly, or something like that. But that's the only sort of standout. So, it's easier when you have a campaign where we're going to push for, this film for in a half dozen different categories, as opposed to if you have only one. So there might be an economy of scale going on there from the inside the studio point of view.
I would also add sound design and sound effects for sound mixing and sound editing for Hereditary. I can imagine it getting nominated for those. Although I think A Quiet Place probably has the best sound editing and sound mixing of all of the nominees. Yet, of course, Quiet Place was only nominated for sound editing. It was not nominated for sound mixing. Yeah, it's a shocker. What about some snubs for you, Garrett?
Well, to me, the biggest one, and easily also the most baffling one, is the fact that Won't You Be My Neighbor was not nominated for Best Documentary, because I'm concerned, I think that's not only the best documentary, I think that's the best film I saw all year. It was a difficult year for me in many ways. While I thought there was a fairly decently large number of good films, there weren't a whole lot of great films, and that was an absolutely great film that completely stood out for me. I am not a huge documentary film consumer. It's definitely a smaller portion of my overall film diet than certain other areas, but I was 100% and completely, absolutely blown away by Won't You Be My Neighbor. I thought it was phenomenal. It was moving. It was one of those things where every step of the film, it gets you deeper and deeper into the wonder and the profundity and the magic that was Fred Rogers, and makes you wonder how such a human being ever could have existed. And if something that good and wholesome and pure and just wonderful can't get recognition, then I don't know what the fuck we're doing here.
Well, Ollie, I've seen 2 of the 5 films that were nominated, Free Solo and RBG. RBG, I think, is good along the same lines as Won't You Be My Neighbor. Free Solo has some really great cinematography. I would have nominated both of those. I need to see Hale County this evening, Minding the Gap, and Of Fathers and Sons. I just started Minding the Gap, and it basically reminds me of it's like mid-90s, the documentary. It's about skateboarders and whatnot. So I need to see more of that film in order to make a clear decision about that. But yes, I mean, Won't You Be My Neighbor was my third favorite film of the year. If I have to cut out RBG and Free Solo, I would, for Won't You Be My Neighbor's sake, because Won't You Be My Neighbor was better than those. So another snub in the documentary category was Three Identical Strangers, which was also quite a good film. That's the first act of that film is crazy, and then it gets crazier. I won't give much away about that, but three twins find each other, having never known that the other existed throughout their entire lives, and then it gets crazier. Some other things. I hate Green Book getting nominated because it's, of all of the interesting films about race this year, Green Book is the least interesting and least ambitious. I would have loved to see them sort of nominate Sorry to Bother You, even though I think that film has flaws, and Blind Spotting over something like Green Book. That said, I wouldn't mind if Mahershala Ali, who seems to be the odds-on favorite for Best Supporting Actor, I wouldn't mind if he gets Best Supporting Actor win. But the rest of that movie should not be so honored. It's simplistic, it's didactic. African American filmmakers have made far more interesting films about race this year than Peter Farrelly did, and for that, I don't have too much against it. I gave it 2 stars, so it's not a film that I absolutely hated. I think it's my least favorite good movie of the year. The fact that it got 5 nominations is probably 4 too many. Best Picture nod is not. I'm not happy about the Best Picture nod or the Best Screenplay nod, but I'm glad that it didn't get Best Director and some of those others.
I'm going to sort of expand on that theme and sort of, when I look at the Best Picture noms, it's a list to me that really screams this was a weak year. It's not that the films on the Best Picture list are bad films.
Let's read them real quick for our viewers, just in case they don't know.
So the Best Pictures are, okay, we'll go for it.
Yeah, I'll just read through them real quick, and then you can make your point. Black Panther, Black Klansman, Bohemian Rhapsody, The Favorite, Green Book, Roma, Star is Born, Vice. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, and again, I'm first, I haven't not seen Roma or The Favorite, but not bad films. We got solid films, glad films, worth seeing, definitely enjoyed. But I think in a different year, arguably none of these would have been even nominated for Best Picture if the competition were a little bit stiffer.
Right.
On that list, I mean, part of me would love to see Black Panther win just because, for the cultural significance of it, for the idea
of SAG.
Was that?
It took the SAG for Best Picture. Well, Best Ensemble Acting in a Film, which is essentially the SAG Award for Best Picture. Right. Screen Actors Guild gave Black Panther its highest honors.
That's impressive.
I know.
And yeah, I mean, so both because it's a comic book movie, but also because it's a almost entirely African descended cast. And so that would be cool. But at the same time, I think just film qua film on its merits, I don't think it's Best Picture material. Again, Black Klansman, of course, was really interesting and curious, like pretty much everything Spike Lee does. But I don't think it's actually probably middling Spike Lee when it comes to his sort of oeuvre. Bohemian Rhapsody had the incredible strength of Rami Malek's performance. Definitely nominate him for Best Actor, but Best Picture, no. And
right,
could go down the list. All of these films have their merits, and they're all good movies, but none of them are great movies. None of them are Best Picture, the way I typically think of them.
Well, the one that's most Best Picture-y is Roma, and I think that's going to be the odds-on favorite for Best Picture for taking home the Oscar on February 24th. Roma is it's an interesting film. I think I need to see it again because I think that it's a director's film. It's a film in which you see Alfonso Cuarón um, at the height of his powers. Like every single shot is talk about every frame of painting. Every frame of that film is a painting. It's incredible cinematography and an incredible directing job. And I think basically because of sort of a process of elimination, that's probably what's going to take it. I mean, Black Panther, they're not going to nominate. They're not going to win a comic book movie, award the win to a comic book movie. Black Klansman has its controversy. Bohemian Rhapsody is not loved among critics. Green Book, same thing. The Favorite has it's sort of a stuffy film that maybe has a chance. Star is Born, that star is fading, and Vice also controversial. Probably won't get its and it's got some weakness. Vice has got some weaknesses as well. So I think Roma, sort of by a process of elimination, is going to be the film that takes home Best Picture.
So you're telling me The Favorite is not The Favorite?
No, it is not The Favorite. We will roam to Roma. All right. Anyway, that was awful. Yeah, and I know you haven't seen Roma yet, but it's I don't know. I'm curious whether I missed anything the first go around. It didn't really connect with me.
It seems like a slow film that you have to be in the right mood for.
It requires a lot of patience. There are two scenes in the third act, or one scene at the end of the second act and one scene at the end of the third act that were super compelling, and everything else is really well shot. I just don't know if I was able to attach myself to the film the way a lot of the Academy voters seem to have. It took home 10 nominations, tied with The Favorite for the most nominations of the day. So we shall see what we shall see. Let's see. Anything else that we want to highlight about this? Happy about Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse getting animated feature. Happy about Mary Queen of Scots getting makeup and hair. That's well done. That needs to happen. And visual effects, Christopher Robin got a best visual effects nomination, which that seemed to be, let me read the visual effects awards. Avengers Infinity War, First Man, Ready Player One, Solo: A Star Is Born, or Solo: A Star Wars Story. Would that be a good mashup? Solo: A Star Wars Story, and Christopher Robin. One of these is not like the others. Anyway, any other things that you want to highlight about this, the Oscar picks?
I think I was glad to see If Beale Street Could Talk got adapted screenplay. I'm not sure I necessarily want that to win, but I think it's deserving of the nomination.
Yes.
I was somewhat surprised by First Reformed getting a nomination for original screenplay. I mean, I know it's gotten a fair amount of praise, but frankly, I thought the screenplay was kind of boring. Phenomenal performance from Ethan Hawke. Maybe a little surprised that Ethan Hawke didn't get a nomination for actor, possibly. Arguably, I think that was definitely the strength of the film, not the screenplay. So,
yeah, I agree with that. Original screenplay for me, though, would be Eighth Grade. Bo Burnham's screenplay for Eighth Grade was spot on, and Eighth Grade is probably my second favorite film of the year. Adapted screenplay, I think Annihilation deserved a adapted screenplay, and Annihilation also deserves the best visual effect. Kick Christopher Robin the fuck out of there and put in Annihilation. Those were my two favorite films of the year, and yet they were both not nominated for any Oscars, which I found to be quite disheartening. Okay. You don't want to do any predictions, do you? You don't like predicting things?
No, I've found that the 2016 election has showed me that my crystal ball sucks, and I'm going to wait a few more years before I take it out of the shop and dust it off and see if it works again.
Oh, just in time for 2020. All right. Speaking of the Oscars, next week we will be reviewing a film that is nominated for Best Director, sort of a surprise Best Director nomination for Powell Pawlowski. Powell Pawlikowski for Cold War. This is a film that I know zero about. This is a film that's not on my radar. I don't know anything about it. I'm not going to look up anything about it. And since it's not opening in Evansville, I don't have to do a preview for this film. So I can go into this film without watching any of the trailers. It's one of my favorite ways to watch movies. Go into a film completely cold.
And you're going
I
all
will.
the way to Nashville to see it.
I'm driving 2 hours to see Cold War in Nashville. So I will be 2-3 hours. I don't even know how long it takes. But yes, I will be looking forward to reviewing Cold War. I don't know anything about it. You told me you looked up. What did you look up? That it was.
It was the Roger Ebert's website. I think it was compared it with Casablanca. So
that's going to be our movie club entry. So we'll do Cold War and Casablanca next week on Jim and Garrett at the Movies. I will finally know something about Cold War and review it next week, and as will you. And we'll also talk about one of the great films. I think it's my second favorite film of all time, Casablanca, on next week. So until then, I'm Jim.
And I'm Garrett.
And this has been
Jim and Garrett at the Movies.
Good night.